Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Singapore. The European Union is facing many challenges, ranging from the debt and refugee crisis to its ties with Russia, to say nothing of the issue of terrorism. How does a German expert of defense look at these challenges, as well as the chance of Europe in China and Asia? Today, I'm happy to be joined here by Dr. Bastian Gingerich, a senior research fellow with the International Institute of Strategic Studies, which is based in London. But before we start the interview, let's look at this.
A trust deficit is rising within EU nations. Public confidence has fallen to historically low levels. Figures from Eurobarometer, the EU's polling organisation, show a vertiginous decline in trust in countries such as Spain, Germany and Italy. France is already under a state of emergency following last year's assaults, which left 130 people dead and many more wounded. In March, 32 people died in neighbouring Belgium when suicide blasts hit Brussels airport and a metro station. Both the Paris and the Brussels attacks were claimed by ISIL. Apart from the terrorist threats, there are also fears for the future of the Union. In just 2 weeks, British voters will decide on whether the UK becomes the first nation to quit the European Union since its inception over 60 years ago.
Are there things about Europe that frustrate you? Yes. Look, I'm the Prime Minister who sits around the table with 27 other heads of government and state, and sometimes this organisation drives me crazy. But do I sit there and think Britain would be better off if we left? You know, are we quitters? Do we think we quit the European Union, we quit the single market, and that somehow we would be better off? Absolutely not.
With the EU suffering terrorist threat, economic malaise and a migrant crisis, recent US moves in Europe seem set to put more strain on EU-Russia relations. The US has activated a missile interceptor in southern Romania. It will be integrated into the NATO missile shield in July. And last Friday, Washington announced the construction of an anti-ballistic missile defense site in Poland. The US and NATO say the system is aimed to protect European NATO states against Iran's missile program, but Russia calls it a security threat.
Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
Thank you very much.
There are many interpretations about the global implications of China's rapid expansion economically and geopolitically, if you like. There is, however, a quiet sense of alienation between the two sides of the Atlantic Ocean. If you look at why Britain, Germany, France, and other major European economies offered to join the AIIB despite the opposition from the White House and the Congress in the DC. So what do you think of the current relationship in general between the European Union and China?
Well, I think it's between the European Union and China. It is obviously a relationship that has a very strong economic basis, that is obvious, but so has the transatlantic relationship. And the transatlantic relationship is one that has multiple pillars, which I would say are very strong. And there's obviously the political military relationship in NATO. There is the trade relationship. So I would say that, going back to the initial point that you made, I would say that while EU member states will define their own decisions, their own priorities on certain things, I think it's a strong transatlantic relationship, and I don't think it stands in the way of a strong relationship between the EU and China.
It depends on whether you perceive the rise of China as a threat.
Yeah, I don't think Europeans see the rise of China as a threat. I think Europeans, by and large, in majority, feel that the rise of China is something that can bring a lot of opportunity, a lot of prosperity to a lot of people here in the region, but also in Europe. I think people understand that our prosperity in Europe is linked intrinsically to prosperity here in the region. And China is, of course, an important part of that story. I do think, though, that also, while that is true, and I would say that represents the majority opinion, I do think that many Europeans are also concerned when they look at this region and what they see as a rising tension, perhaps, between China and the United States. And I would suggest that many Europeans hope that that tension can be controlled and resolved and can be prevented from escalating further.
The EU is facing multiple crises. Which is the most pressing? Is there a sequence in which crisis can and should be met, or is it a case of fighting multiple fires all at the same time?
True that Europe, the EU, does face multiple crises, and I do think they can be taken in sequence. I do think we don't have that luxury. We have to address them simultaneously, and some of them have been triggered in our neighborhood, in our external environment. And I think what that means to many Europeans is actually that the order on which they felt Europe was based, with the European Union, with the OSCE, and with NATO as the transatlantic link, those fundamental principles have now been challenged by Russia. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed. In our southern neighborhood, of course, we have seen the rapid rise of Daesh, of ISIS, the savage violence that has affected that region, and the effects that had on state stability, and of course then on migration patterns, on migration flows, which have affected Europe in quite a dramatic way. And I think it is fair to say that is a crisis that needs to be solved, because I think many Europeans feel a very clear humanitarian impulse to help and provide assistance, and at the same time, of course, the challenge of integrating all these newcomers and providing an environment that is sustainable in that regard is a big challenge. And then finally, it's probably also worth pointing out that Europe still faces an economic challenge. Growth rates in Europe, while they have recovered from the financial and economic crisis of a few years ago, they are still rather sluggish. And I think that is another aspect. How can we stimulate growth? And as a result of that, how can we make sure that there is the perception among our populations in Europe and our electorates that European integration is a process that they benefit from.
Of the mandate of NATO in Afghanistan. Currently, India and China, along with other major powers, are trying to re-establish and reconstruct Afghanistan as a peacemaking nation. Do you think the presence of China in Afghanistan is an indispensable part of the exit strategy of the United States, because we are there to help, to assist with the rebuilding of a strife-torn country?
Well, I think there are a couple of elements to your question there, and let me start with the first one. And I think I disagree with you there. I think NATO's military relevance was always there. It has just evolved. It has evolved in light of an evolving international security environment. NATO pursues three core tasks. One is territorial defense, one is crisis management, and the third one is cooperative security. And those are all elements that are important to NATO. All of them have a military dimension. I think what is true, though, is that the balance between those tasks might shift over time. And arguably now with Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and Russia's sponsorship of armed separatism in eastern Ukraine has certainly for many NATO member states in Europe driven up the perception that territorial defense is again something that is of greater importance than perhaps they have thought recently. So I think NATO continues to evolve, and I think because it evolves, it remains relevant to its members. Members feel that it provides value even in the context of a changing security environment, and from an organizational point of view, that is what an organization should do. It needs to adjust and adapt with the world around it in order to continue to provide a benefit. I think with regards to the other element of your question, with regards to Afghanistan, I think China has come comparatively late to this stabilization effort. And I think from the perspective of NATO member states, I think anything that China does to contribute to a peaceful or a more peaceful and a stable development of Afghanistan will be welcome by NATO member states. I do think, though, that, because you mentioned the word exit strategy, I do think, though, that NATO member states will continue to make their independent judgment on when they'd like to end their engagement there. If China helps solving the problems that Afghanistan still faces, I think that will be very welcome.
Despite the two devastating world wars in Europe, great politicians of Germany, such as Bismarck, said the security of Germany lies more in the relationship between Moscow and Berlin than perhaps with the rest of Europe. And therefore, observers outside Europe say and have discovered that the policy that the Chancellor Angela Merkel pursued since the crisis in Crimea is different somehow from the expectations of the White House. For example, Madame Merkel has persuaded the White House, the Pentagon, not to sell heavy weapons to government forces in Kiev. Many other approaches suggest clearly that Berlin handled the crisis in Ukraine and indeed the strained relationship between NATO and Moscow very, very carefully. In this context, what do you think of the new type of major power relationship between Germany and Russia in the wake of the Cold War?
Well, I think Angela Merkel and her government have shown a lot of leadership actually in crisis diplomacy around Ukraine, and I think that was something that happened in close coordination with the United States, and I think it was a development that was very welcome in Washington. Now, I think it is normal in such a difficult situation that even very close partners might have different preferences when it comes to very specific policy options, and the approach that was chosen, of course, is that one talks about it, as one does among friends, and then comes to a solution that is then supported. And I think that has been the pattern of German diplomacy in this case. I think with regards to our relation or the German relationship with Russia, I think it has changed quite a bit, and I think it has changed quite a bit as a result of the way that Russia chooses to behave recently. It has taken a more assertive and aggressive stance.
Now, the most devastating crisis from the perspective of Asia and those observers outside of Europe is the asylum-seeking tidal waves from the Middle East and from other countries in West Asia, perhaps. What Russia did was try, of course, they tried to stop terrorism and what later on became the refugee crisis by rooting out the hotbed of ISIL or Daesh. This part of the Moscow intention may have been misunderstood. Do you agree? You know, of course, eventually it focuses on the issue of whether President Assad should be kept alive in Damascus. It is this area where United States and Moscow refuse to see eye to eye.
Well, I don't agree with your premise. I don't think, if you look at the Russian military intervention in Syria, and if you look at the targeting, and if you look at where the attacks were and what they targeted, I think you will find that they were not, if the intention was to root out ISIS, then the action and the military strikes do not reflect that priority, I have to say. So I don't agree with you.
What do you think of the air bombardment of the motorcade that allegedly helped assist the traffic of fuel from ISIL into Turkey? That's the observation of the Russian analysts.
Well, look, I'm looking at,
because the United States,
overall,
along with the allies, tried to cut off the financial sources that fueled the terrorism of ISIL, and therefore the alleged trafficking of fuel from ISIL into Turkey may be a major problem, and some of the Europeans chose to ignore this part.
Well, I think
Moscow has been demonized.
I don't think Moscow has been demonized. I think Moscow has demonized itself. I think that is reality, and it is in Moscow's power to change that. But I do think if you look at the overall military activity that Russia has shown in that theater, I think the priority that you suggest Russia pursues, I don't see that. So I disagree with you, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much for being with us. You are watching Dialogue with Dr. Bastian Gigrich, Director of Defense and Military Analysis with the IISS. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you.
What will be the solution to the crisis concerning the Schengen Agreement? Because I traveled in Europe, I saw myself some cops patrolling the border between Germany and your neighboring countries. That didn't happen before. So, and I also find out some disapproval rating for Chancellor Angela Merkel after she boldly decided to accept more refugees, and that has caused his CDU to drop in the approval rating.
Yeah, I think you're right to say that the migration issue in Europe right now is a very difficult one, and that it puts pressure on some of the principles that we had agreed on, and you mentioned Schengen in particular, the ability to, within that Schengen zone, to move freely without border controls and have a free flow of people, goods, and all these things. That is now under pressure. But I think there is a solution will need to evolve around much closer European collaboration on these matters. You have now a situation where, as you pointed out, Angela Merkel decided a little while ago to accept a large number of refugees, and that was a decision that was very controversial. In Germany, after a while, initially there was a lot of support, but also among her partner governments in Europe. And I think that now creates a situation where a new compromise has to be found that will need to involve a better sharing of the burden, and in that sense that has financial implications, that has implications of how refugees are distributed amongst member states, and that's a very difficult question. I agree with you. Therefore, it was important to come to agreements that lower, for the time being, the inflow of new refugees, because I think once you have a bit of time to adjust to the situation, you will see that there is a lot of capacity in bureaucracy, in civil society to address these issues. But the problem is if you have already a large inflow of people and it continues and continues, and now we have a situation where that time might exist to come to a solution. You mentioned Angela Merkel's approval ratings and the difficulty that she currently faces back home in Germany. I mean, you're right, that development has definitely taken place. I think when she made the decision on refugees, I think it was driven by both a humanitarian impulse and an understanding that it is in our interest as Germans to help these people.
Yeah, some of the senior politicians in Brussels have said wisely that generations ago your forefathers and grandfathers were all refugees, and therefore you did display a spirit of humanitarianism. You have said that instead of an alleged democratic deficit in European politics, there is instead actually a trust deficit. What did you mean by that?
I mentioned that, what you just quoted, that statement in the context of the recent Dutch referendum on the cooperation agreement with Ukraine, where, as you might know, the Dutch voted against this cooperation agreement in a referendum. And what I meant by that is that part of that campaign in the Netherlands was driven by the assumption that somehow European institutions lack, EU-level institutions lack democratic legitimacy. And my point was, the point that I was trying to make was that I don't think that is the real problem. The European Parliament is elected directly. Governments that are elected on a national level make major decisions in Brussels. So I don't think the democratic legitimacy of those institutions is the problem. The problem is that some parts of the population in Europe seem to have lost trust in their elected leaders. When they say we're going to pursue a certain solution, the seriousness of those solutions is being questioned by people, by the electorate, and that is a problem. There is a discourse that has evolved that challenges pretty much most major positions that are being brought forward by mainstream politicians, and that's what I meant. There's a trust deficit. I don't think there's a democracy deficit, there's a trust deficit.
It might be an issue of exaggeration to characterize the political dynamics in Greece, which is still recovering from its sovereign debt crisis, or when it comes to the reassessment of politics in Poland, that it is going back to the left-leaning ideology. Democracy is going back in Poland. It might be exaggeration to say so. However, what do you think of a new wave of dynamics and consequently the rise of a far-right movement in European Union?
The basic point you make about the challenge for political systems, different countries in the European Union, you mentioned Greece, you mentioned Poland, but Greece in particular, to deal with the consequences of the sovereign debt crisis, which has enormous social implications and economic implications, has created a political climate which has given left-of-center parties a big boost. That is true. But again, that is a result of what the Greek people chose to pursue. Now, but what I think your more fundamental point is about populist political movements and populist political parties, some of which are right-wing political forces, others are plain old populist, to be honest. I think that is a real concern. You've seen that in several countries in Central Europe. You have seen that in France, and you've seen that in other places. I think so far the verdict is still out on whether these movements will establish themselves as embedded forces in the political spectrum of these countries, but it is clearly a worrying development, and one that the more centrist parties are trying hard to counter.
So long as I'm concerned, the European Union went through two crises concerning the issue of immigration. The first is the expansion of the European Union. You accepted more immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe. The second wave, of course, occurred after the military intervention took place in the Middle East to fuel the Arab Revolution there. Hence, many refugees from not only the Middle East, but from Pakistan and Afghanistan also went to Western Europe. That's a very big challenge today. This led to the upcoming referendum in the UK to decide their future with continental Europe. What do you think of the issue of immigration that has led to the terrorist attacks in Paris and Brussels?
Migration, again, you raise a number of issues that I'm going to try and address. On the British referendum, I don't think it was, the referendum did not come about because of immigration. It came about because the British people and the British political parties, in particular the Conservative Party, have a have mixed feelings about their membership. That is a long-standing issue.
Eurosceptics
that is not a new thing, but it is coming to a decision point right now. But you are right to say that within that campaign that we now have, and we will have the vote on the 23rd of June in the United Kingdom, migration has become a core a rallying point where the people, the part of the political spectrum that campaigns to leave the European Union refers a lot to the migration pressure on the United Kingdom, and the argument that if the UK were to leave the European Union, and it would have more control over its borders and therefore more control over migration flows into the country. That is true. I think that is the argument. I do think, however, that if you look at the reality, the United Kingdom is not in Schengen, so the United Kingdom has control over its borders. It has, however, to face a net influx. More people are coming to the United Kingdom than are leaving, and a lot of those are EU citizens, which have the right to move, and that would be the one element that actually changes. But it's a bit misleading to pretend the UK does not have control over its borders. It does have control over its borders. On the terrorism question that raised, I think it's important to not confuse migrants with terrorists. I think that is a false
That's politically incorrect, of course.
Yeah. I think that would be a wrong and potentially dangerous conclusion. But a problem that is, of course, very real is that given that people who perpetrated these attacks have a migration background, that has raised the pressure within some of our European countries to establish tighter controls and a general degree of anxiety about this issue among the population. That is true, but I wouldn't say it's the cause.
Yes, I notice your note of caution. But Poland, are you worried that the currently elected government in Poland, in Warsaw, will go left, will undermine what you believe are democratic principles?
If you by going left, you mean to the left of the political spectrum. I don't see that happening. But I think what you're alluding to is are certain decisions that the Polish government have taken that are being interpreted by the EU and other governments in Europe as being in conflict with some of the values and norms that the European Union says it supports. So, but I think again, since we are in that setting, speaking to Europeans and friends, I think that can be solved through dialogue and discussion. I don't see this as a fundamental challenge.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you.